It's that time of the year where I'm firing and finishing off many of the projects I've made in the last few months. And this week we're picking up where we left off with these angular pourers, pots made with a spout that was thrown and cut in half and then attached to the body. This was the first prototype I made, and whilst it works wonderfully, I've always felt like the opening and the shape of the spout itself could be improved upon. And so in this video I'll be making 2 more versions with the hope of improving it. Although inevitably, I imagine I'll end up going a bit too far in the other direction, and it will take a third attempt to end up with a shape I'm really happy with, and that pours well, which annoyingly this one does. It's just the shape I'm not totally convinced by, as the spout itself juts out from the body at quite a harsh angle, and I feel like it could flow into the body a bit better. And so that will be the subject of this video, from beginning to end, from lumps of soft clay to the finished, new glaze-fired pieces. For the bodies of these, I'm not weighing out the pieces. Apologies. Instead, I'm just taking 2 reasonable lumps, which I imagine probably weigh about a pound, or about 454 grams. That larger block of clay had already previously been wedged, so with these 2 smaller pieces, I'll just give them a quick pat and roll to bring the lumps together and to mix the clay, so there are no harder lumps or softer sections. What you need when throwing on the wheel is clay that's smooth and even in terms of texture throughout. It's for that reason that when you're centering, coning up and down can be so helpful, as this process really helps to blend the body. And to do this, I force the clay up into a cone shape like so, and then press it back down. And with a small piece of clay you can really feel the change after doing this a couple of times. Often when throwing, you might feel a slight inconsistency, or there could be a bubble, or just some sort of knot within the lump of clay that doesn't feel right. And after coning the clay up and down a couple of times, you will really begin to feel the clay mix and knit together and become more plastic and more responsive, and therefore hopefully easier to throw with. This is always a step I take more seriously when I'm throwing bigger pots. Anything over 2 kilos, really, I'll try to cone more thoroughly. Yet, truth be told, with smaller lumps, especially for pots I'm really familiar with, such as mugs or bowls, I will occasionally skip it altogether, as I can throw the pots in such a way that if any undulation appears, I can deal with it. Equally, the shapes themselves are so simple that even if there is a slight irregularity within the clay I'm working with, it won't be detrimental for the pot itself. On the other hand, if I'm making something more complex and angular, slight irregularities in the clay can completely throw the shape off, so I need to be more diligent. With the clay centered, the walls can begin to be pulled up, a process I won't discuss in too much detail here, but if you would like to learn more about the throwing process as a whole, such as pulling up, how to center, how to open up, and how to shape pots, then I really recommend the videos in my Beginner's Guide series, which I'll leave a link to on screen now and in the description below. In a way, there's just too many small things to discuss, and if I were to break down each small step in the throwing process, this video would likely be a few hours long. With the angular shape thrown, I cup the pot with dry hands and lift the vessel away. My aim isn't to make these 2 pots exactly the same shape, so I'm not using my throwing guide for these, or measuring them. I'm simply going by eye and throwing them into a shape that looks nice, proportionally so. I want these forms to have a tapering lower section that's rather tall, and then at the top I want them to slope inward, so they sort of mirror the rest of my angular shapes, as well as sort of containing the liquid when the vessel is tipped over to one side, sort of what you find on a classic beggar's bowl, where the shape is made in such a way to help keep the contents inside. The only thing this pot won't be is particularly stable due to its narrow base, but that doesn't particularly faze me. It'll be heavier when filled with liquid anyway. And I think these days, things like stability aren't really something that I'm concerned with. If it's a choice between the pot being slightly more artistic and unique, I'd rather pursue that route than make pots that are all just simply completely functional without regard for anything else. I think most people buy my pots because they are a particular style anyway, so if anything, I'm going to lean into that style and make pots that are more recognisable as mine. Right, that's the bodies of these thrown. They're actually rather nice like this, as simple vases. Truth be told, that does occasionally happen. I'll make pots for one intended purpose, and then, after they've been thrown or trimmed, I'll decide to leave them as be, without any appendages attached, or lids trimmed to fit the galleries. As soon as I'm able to flip these pots over onto their rims, I do. At the same time, if I notice that any portion of them is turning a bit too firm, and just bordering on turning bone dry, I give them a good spray with water, or I even dunk them in water, if the shape is a bit more robust and I feel they can take it. Either way, the pots being flipped over is important, as the bottoms of pots are always a bit damper and take longer to dry. How long does it take for a pot to turn leather hard though, is another question altogether, as there are just too many contributing factors for there to be one simple answer. The type of clay used, what country you live in, Have the kilns been on? How thick are the walls of your pot? Did you leave much slip covering the vessels when you took them off the wheel? Have you covered them in plastic or sealed them away to dry? All of this plays into how quickly your clay will dry to leather hard. And rather than being fixated on this time frame, I think it's a better approach to teach yourself how to identify when clay is perfectly leather hard. And perhaps most annoyingly about this is if you are practicing in a communal studio, a place where you don't have full control over the drying process itself, then this is also a much more difficult thing to learn, as ultimately how to dry work properly is something you learn through experience. Right, enough of that. It's now the following day and I'm going to throw the spouts for these pourers. These don't need to be complicated and essentially I'm just making tiny cylinders. I level the top by slicing away the excess if it is wobbling too much, and then I carefully use a chamois leather to soften this lip. Next, the sides are scraped clean, and I actually remove rather a lot of material as I do this, thinning the walls further. I then create an undercut beneath it, a gap of sorts that will make it easier to draw my wire underneath. It's severed off and then I simply lift it away with 2 dry fingers, and even if the walls are a touch thick at the moment, I'll be able to carve them back thinner later. I'm throwing these ones to have more of a curve to them, so when they are attached, they blend more naturally into the pot, as compared to jutting out sharply like the previous version does. The part I'm most focused on is the lip of these. I need it to be crisp and sharp, so that it slices through the liquid when a pour is initiated or stopped. Although ultimately with pots like this, I think my greatest issue is that even though I make these components to be really sharp and thin and fine, I end up covering them in a rather thick, globular glaze that can lessen the functionality of the pots and make them pour worse in some cases, which is why I need to be so exacting about making them thin and fine at this point. The opening of this pot was slightly oval, so after the pot was attached to the wheel head, I pressed a round bowl into its opening, forcing it back to being round. You can also see on this piece a slight unevenness in terms of dryness, as part of the clay that spins around is whiter and drier than the other side, which, if it was any worse, I would deal with properly, but I should be able to get away with it. With this process of trimming, I'm thinning out the walls and lightening the vessel, yet there isn't much work to do on these, as I threw them thinly to begin with. The pot is then sliced off the wheel, flipped upside down, tap centered, and then secured in place with 3 lumps of clay. I also use a spinner tool to push down through, keeping the pot pinned in place from above, as it can be rather common when you're turning for your tools to catch and the pot to suddenly jump, jolting in place and coming out of its restraints. So when you're trimming, you almost always need to apply some kind of downward force, be it with the spinner, your fingers, or the trimming tool itself. I use all 3 in different situations. For instance, if the clay is really coarse, I'm more likely to use a spinner if I'm doing a lot of turning, as having really grogged clay grind against your fingertips for a couple of hours will leave your skin red and raw, so I try and avoid that if I can. I trim a shallow foot ring into the base itself, burnish the bottom too so the clay is lovely and smooth, and then stamp it with my maker's mark. And then I repeat the entire process again for the second piece. And sometimes I just burnish the rim so it's lovely and smooth, as when upturned on the metal wheelhead, if the pot rubs against it or bounces or moves, it can leave the clay slightly damaged or rough or flat in places, and if I've noticed that's happened, I'll fix it afterwards like so. The next step in the process is attaching the spouts, so I begin by slicing them in half, which I do with a sharp metal rib. You can see they are still relatively thick, but I will pinch one end so it has a more tapering shape, and then I'll roughly see what it looks like when positioned on the pot. I'll then make a mark indicating where I need to pierce the hole in the body. For this, I'm just using a hole piercer, which I press against the stoneware and rotate, whilst also keeping a hand behind the hole piercer, bracing the walls so the shape of the pot isn't distorted. Next, I'll carve the opening to be a touch larger so that it matches the width of the spout. I scrape away the burrs of clay on the front, and then I take a wet sponge on a stick, insert it into the hole and rotate it in place. This should even everything out and make a very neat opening into the pot. But I will say at this point, and with rose tinted specs, that I should have made the hole both larger and also carved it so it had a flat top instead of this simple circular opening, as I think this would have matched the aesthetic of my work much better. The next thing I'll do is carve away some of the excess from this spout and then smooth over the form with a sponge on a stick, or a diddler as they were called back in the day when commonly used in British industrial ceramics. I then roughen up a patch underneath the hole, which is a process called scoring, which I'll also do to the back of the spout too. I then dip the spout into a small basin of water, as this will soften the clay on the bottom of the spout, making it much easier to press and blend into the body of the pourer. I can even angle it to the desired position, and then I can blend all that soft clay into the body of the pot. The inside needs rather a lot of attention too, so I use the diddler again to soften the clay and blend the two parts together flush. These are still tricky things to get right, and I found myself having to add a bit more clay back, and then I carved more material away from the tip to make it less bulky. But I think this is as far as I'll take it at this point. It is a bit rough around the edges, but instead of potentially overworking it and ruining it at this point, I'm instead going to bisquefy the pot, as this will harden and strengthen the clay considerably, and then I'll use very fine sandpaper to do those last adjustments. I also round the rim, once again, just at the very end, as the process of attaching a spout puts a lot of pressure on one side of the pot and can force it to be distorted slightly in that direction. Right. Let's try again. I'm slicing this one with a bit more material on it this time, just so I've got a bit more to work with. Twisting the sponge in place like this sands away the clay around it, making the opening larger. After putting this video together and doing the narration, I'm excited to try and make these again, as when watching footage like this back, I tend to really analyse the pots I'm making, the shapes, the mistakes, and what could be improved upon, and I've got a whole list of ideas for the third batch of these, but all of that will have to come in another video in the future, if that is something you guys are interested in seeing. I dip the spout in water, slip the scored section on the pourer, and then really firmly press the spout onto it. And this is surprisingly tricky, as I don't want to apply too much pressure to the lip of the spout, as that could potentially damage it. And already, even with the spout just tacked on a bit at this stage, I prefer this shape much more. The severe straight angle at the top and the curved underside of the spout work, but I think mainly it's the angle at which the spout is projecting from the vessel itself. This one juts out at roughly a 40-degree angle, and it looks so much better for it. The outside is then sponged and smoothed over to blend in the smudges of clay left over from where I've worked it with my fingers. The only thing about doing this is the wet sponge grinds away the softer clay, leaving sharp, raised white specks in its wake. Those are the white spots you can see covering the surface. It's grog, pre-fired ceramic material added to the body to give it strength. And so to smooth these back in, I simply compress the surface with a wet finger. And again, I just make sure the rim is round by pressing a bowl into it and twisting it in place. And here's a better example of the clay work that I think is easier to tidy up once the pot has been bisque-fired. I could fuss around and really try and perfect it at this stage, but with all the grog the body contains, it's so absurdly easy to make a mistake. But by doing it instead after the pot has been bisque-fired, many of these risks are simply negated, and I think it's one of the rare instances where sanding bisqueware is appropriate. To ensure these pieces dry nicely without cracking, I'll spray them rather well with water and then wrap them up tightly with plastic. This is especially important considering one half of one of these was really quite dry, and by spraying them and wrapping them up in a humid environment, the clay of the body and the spout will acclimatise, the parts becoming the same texture, after which, having spent a few days under wraps, I'll dry them out properly so they're bone dry, which is when these pots will be loaded into my electric kiln to be bisque-fired to 1000 degrees Celsius. 2 days later, and the pots are now cool enough to unpack. And in this bisque-fired state, the clay is much stronger and porous too, which is useful for glazing. And now that the clay is hardened, I'll be able to sand these inner portions of the spout, the underside too, until it's all much smoother, and some of those ledges or lines of clay that were left are removed. It's also a good time to test how well they pour, together with washing all the dust off the vessel, as the absolute last thing you want to do is try and glaze a dusty surface, as doing so is a really guaranteed way of having your glaze crawl, which is what we call it when the glaze begins to separate from itself. It crawls apart, leaving small patches of bare clay, which, with my uniform glassy surfaces, is the last thing I want. The pour isn't bad, but there tends to be more ferocity when liquid is channeled into a spout that's fully closed and has a smaller opening, whereas with this piece, half of the spout is missing. So the liquid isn't really funneled at all, resulting in a more cascading pour. The next step is to wax the bottoms of each. This way, when dipped in glaze, this area can't absorb water, which means the raw materials that make up the glaze can't adhere to it. It's a simple premise, and this wax just burns away during the reduction firing, leaving absolutely no trace it was ever there. And this extra dab I do at the end is done just to make sure my maker's mark is fully covered. Next, there's the glazing. Each is held with a pair of tongs, submerged into the glaze, and then quickly drawn out, the excess flowing off the bottom in drips. And despite it being waxed, there's still always a few droplets that cling to it. The following day, after the pot has dried out fully, I'll now spend some time tidying up the surfaces, all in order to make the surfaces flush and even as possible. Any raised, uneven section is ground down to be flush with the rest of the surface, and the spout is worked with a needle to get rid of any small drips or inconsistencies therein. This is slow, fastidious work, but the more carefully I finish the surface, the better the end result should be. So I try to take my time. I don't rush it, as the powdery layer of glaze itself is really fragile, and it's really easy to overdo it, to remove too much and create a thin spot, like I did here on the lip, which is why I'm retouching it with some additional glaze, that I then really delicately rubbed back, flush, which is the same thing I do for most of those pock marks across the surface, though only if they are significant, as they don't tend to show after being fired. The last step is to sponge the base, removing those pesky bits of glaze that always settle on the wax, and making that line where glaze and clay meet really smooth and even all the way round. With that done, the pot is loaded into my gas kiln alongside all the others, and these pink and red tones you see here, due to red iron oxide the glazes contain, will turn into pinks and blues and even blacks once reduction fired. I normally squeeze in about 150 pots, and the kiln itself takes about 9 hours to fire from start to finish, going all the way up to cone 10, which is about 1290 degrees Celsius. And once that top temperature has been hit, the kiln is switched off, and from this point, the kiln takes about 2 days to cool down fully. And here's the first of one of these pourers, with a lip that's been blackened by carbon, which I'm not the most pleased about. Of all the places it could have occurred, I wish it had happened somewhere else. There's also a big pinhole, so there is a chance I'll refire both of these pieces to try and get better results. For now though, I sand the bottom of each with the 200 grit diamond pad made by Diamond Core Tools, just to take the edge off the rough clay. I certainly don't want to sand away any of the colour the clay can have. If I don't do this, the stoneware can be coarse enough to scratch the surface it's placed on. The darker green pourer looks great, the glaze is even, and there are lots of lovely big iron spots covering it, and I think at this stage already I can identify a potential issue, not with the dark green version, but with the pale green one, which has an opening that's a bit too small, I think, and I have a hunch it'll impact how well this piece works, so let's test them. We'll try the dodgy one first. It pours relatively well, but the hole is so small that not enough liquid can pass through it for it to pour with any ferocity. Equally, as the amount of liquid lessens in the vessel, you really have to tip it over to get the last dregs out, and you run the risk of the liquid itself flowing over the rim of the pot, instead of through the spout. The dark green one, on the other hand, works much better. It pours with a bit more force, the water shooting out in a relatively neat stream. The pierced hole on this piece is larger. The spout itself too is taller, so it directs and contains the liquid better. And when the pour itself is stopped, it doesn't drip much, although a bead of water tends to cling onto the lip, but at least the water doesn't dribble down the side of the pot. I'm actually a bit surprised by how well this version works. I think the spout section still needs some refinement aesthetically, and the hole in my next iterations will be cut larger and with a flat top, so it mirrors the rim of the vessel above it. I also think this is another one of my shapes that will benefit from having a thinner glaze, as the spouts do feel a bit cumbersome and smoothed over by the veneer of molten glass that covers them. So I think when I make these next, I'm going to do it with black clay and crimson glaze. I hope you like these somewhat strange pourers. I've certainly enjoyed throwing and putting them together, although now I'm dying to make a larger third batch. Anyway, thank you for making it to the end. It really means a lot. And, as always, I'll see you next week.